Hello, and welcome to People of the Pod, brought to you by American Jewish Committee. Each week, we take you beyond the headlines to help you understand what they all mean for America, Israel, and the Jewish people. I'm your host, Manya Brashear-Pashman. In his final Easter homily, delivered from the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Pope Francis called for a release of the Israeli hostages still held by Hamas and an end to the war in Gaza. Less than 24 hours later, Pope Francis, the first Latin American-born leader of the Catholic Church, died at the age of 88. Here to discuss the late pontiff's legacy with the Jewish people is Rabbi Noam Marans, AJC's Director of Interreligious Affairs. Rabbi, welcome.
Good to be with you, Manya.
So I must confess, I have been very sad about the Pope's declining health and inevitable passing. I covered his election in Rome in 2013, and I remember standing out in the rain in St. Peter's Square that night when Jorge Bergoglio's name was announced from the balcony, along with his new name, Pope Francis. We didn't know much about him at that point. He had not been all that prolific or public, but one book that he did pen had been co-authored with a rabbi, which was a very curious revelation. What do you recall from those days and what you knew about his relationship with the Jewish community at that time?
If I may, I think I want to begin by offering words of solidarity and comfort to our Catholic brothers and sisters worldwide, not just the 1.234 billion Catholics that there are in the world, but all people, both of faith and of no faith, who identified strongly with this Pope. Regarding the Jewish people and Pope Francis, this is very interesting because he had a very strong relationship before his pontificate with the local Argentinian Jewish community, a strong, vibrant community, particularly with his good friend, Rabbi Avraham Skorka, with whom he wrote a book, as you said, which actually was a transcript in part of a television show that they had together in which they discussed issues. So Pope Francis was not new to Jews and Judaism. He had a vibrant priesthood, bishop, archbishop, cardinal in Buenos Aires and environs, where there is a vibrant Jewish community. And like other Catholic leaders in the post-Nostra Aetate, post-Second Vatican Council era of Catholic Jewish relations, was in relationship with living, real community Jews.
So he did seem, at least very early on, to make improving relations with the Jewish community a priority. Over the next 12 years after his election, how did that evolve? Did his actions back that up?
The first thing we need to say about Pope Francis is that he did the things that popes do regarding Catholic-Jewish relations in the post-Nostra Aetate, post-radical transformation of Catholic-Jewish relations that's associated with the Second Vatican Council and the transformative document of 1965, of October 28th, 1965. And what do popes do in that post-Nostra Aetate era? They prioritize dramatic symbols of the new era of Catholic-Jewish relations. So like Catholics like to say, Pope John Paul II was the first pope since Peter to visit a synagogue. I love when they say that. So much to unpack there. And of course, that's what John Paul II did with his long pontificate, transformative Catholic Jewish relations pontificate. And so did Pope Benedict XVI. And Pope Francis followed in those footsteps. That's one piece. The second is a state visit to the state of Israel. 3 popes in a row. After diplomatic relations are established between the Vatican and Israel in the 1990s under the leadership of Pope St. John Paul II. And Lastly, in this regard, these big pictures, a visit to Auschwitz, where the Pope symbolically shows the contrition, the emotion that the Catholic Church feels through its Pope regarding the relationship of Christianity and anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, which minimally was foundational to violence against Jews, arguably including the Holocaust. But it's more than that. He also regularly condemned anti-Semitism as unchristian, as a sin against God. So it started and frankly continued in a very positive vein. That doesn't mean there weren't challenges and hiccups and controversies, which we can speak about.
I want to go back to what you said about his trip to Israel. Obviously, he was not the first pope to make that trip, but for Pope Francis, it was his first papal trip abroad. He also named a cardinal to Jerusalem who will now help choose his successor in the next conclave. Was his visit to Israel or any of these gestures, were they historic or groundbreaking in any other way?
So there was a big time span between his trip to Israel and his appointment of Cardinal Pizzaballa, the Latin patriarch, during the latter years of Francis's pontificate. The appointment of Cardinal Pizzaballa is important because it demonstrates the importance, the centrality of Jerusalem and all of the issues therein. And Cardinal Pizzaballa is a bridge builder like few are, and therefore that focus is very positive. Regarding the trip to Israel, yes, there were always on a trip to Israel dramatic moments. Of course, Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum, but an impromptu stop at the security wall that caused some controversy because it was seen as one side of the narrative, the Palestinian side of the narrative. But then he did something that no pope has ever done, visited the grave of Theodor Herzl, who was reinterred in the state of Israel after his death. And no pope had ever visited Herzl, the father of modern political Zionism. And for me, it was a very dramatic turnaround because Theodor Herzl was soliciting papal help in the early 1900s, and at least according to his diary, which is the only source we have, was very much rejected by the then sitting pope. So, there's always controversy in visits to Israel, but it was broadly positive because what picture is worth 1,000 words? A pope going over to the Western Wall and putting a note into the wall. This has the ability to undo, well, that's too strong a word, to compensate a bit for a very rugged, to say the least, history.
So a positive wall and a controversial wall. I think, though, he was about breaking down the walls, right? I mean, that was part of his legacy?
He certainly was a person who was a people's pope. He reached out. If you're in his presence, you felt that he never tired of the human engagement. And remember, often when I was in his presence, he was shaking many hands. And he felt as if it was a new experience each time for him, looking into your eyes, certainly when he was feeling healthier and a bit younger. So that was always the case with Pope Francis. But there have been some challenges in Catholic-Jewish relations during his papacy, which is not unheard of. Some of them were more challenging than in more recent history.
Let's talk about those more recent challenges. Though some of his last words, his Easter homily on Sunday, did call for an end to the war in Gaza and a return of the hostages, many in the Jewish community did not appreciate how Pope Francis addressed Israel's actions after October 7th, 2023.
There's no question that Pope Francis's comments since October 7th have engendered some type of crisis in Catholic-Jewish relations. We don't always know what the level of a crisis is when we're in it. We need the perspective of time. I think this was more a Israel, Pope Francis, and the Jewish people crisis. I'm not sure it's a wider Catholic-Jewish relations crisis. And let me first explain what it is and then put it into perspective. The crisis revolves around the fact that despite some empathetic gestures, including meeting with hostage families, including meeting with wounded Israelis, some of Pope Francis's public analyses of what was happening were very disappointing to Jewish leaders, the Jewish community, in which there wasn't enough clarity that there is a difference between what Hamas did on October 7th and tried to do to the Jewish people, to the state of Israel, on the most horrific day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust, and, in contradistinction, Israel's response, in which innocents who were used as human shields quite often perished in large numbers. There has to be a moral difference between these two things, and too often, in my mind, in the mind of many others, there wasn't enough moral clarity and distinguishing between these two types of sad violence.
You mentioned the perspective of time. I think that's a good segue into Pope Francis's decision to open the doors to the Holocaust archive. That was something that had been long sought, and he finally opened those doors. Why?
So I think that eventually the doors would be open, but Pope Francis gave the directive to hurry up and address it. And a lot of this was in the context of the potential beatification and sainthood of Pope Pius XII. At the moment, I don't really think that's on the table. But at the regular glacial speed of the Vatican archives from this period did open literally in the first few weeks of COVID. So it was very problematic because it's a limited number of scholars who can get in, who are approved. He opened it up very dramatically. Maybe he announced it a year in advance. I can't remember now off the top of my head. We're not afraid of history. And the Vatican has participated in conferences about what has been revealed from these new archives. Vatican remains still a little defensive about this period. And I don't think there's necessarily going to be a meeting of the minds about this. But there seems to be more open conversation, and scholars are duking it out the way scholars do. But you asked me about perspective. This is a very important topic. Why? It's one of the great unresolved chapters of Holocaust historiography. And it's enormous. It's not just the archives in Rome, it's all over the world. And so much work still yet needs to be done. And, of course, it was perceived by the Jewish people as the culmination moment of 2 millennia of anti-Jewish teaching that was co-opted in an anti-Semitic way and a race theory of Hitler for the destruction of the Jewish people. So that event, the Holocaust, and of course the state of Israel in a different way, are central to the Catholic-Jewish conversation. And that's what you mean by perspective. If these issues are not part of the conversation, we're talking around the issues and not about them.
As I mentioned earlier, Pope Francis was not all that prolific before he became Pope. That certainly changed. There were so many books for adults, for children. There were so many homilies delivered, social media missives, a lot. I'm curious what Pope Francis said publicly and what he did not say publicly. And did that change quite a bit over his 12-year papacy?
We are speaking, of course, in my area of expertise, Catholic-Jewish relations, not all of his papacy in all of its perspectives. The most important positive thing is what I mentioned earlier, that he regularly used his bully pulpit to condemn anti-Semitism as unchristian and a sin against God. He used to say rhetorically, how could a Christian be anti-Semitic? He didn't mean, is there really a Christian out there who's anti-Semitic? That's not what he meant. He meant that it's irrational. It makes no sense. Our roots are in Judaism. Our identity is intrinsic, right? Judaism is intrinsic to our identity, popes like to say. So that's one piece. Since October 7th, there were challenges because the Pope spoke about the war dozens, maybe even more than 100 times. And he would reference it in his Sunday Angelus and his Wednesday audiences when he would be talking about different places in the world. And sometimes he was empathetic, but sometimes the times that people who identify with Israel's plight remember the most, he was judgmental about Israel. And he wasn't clear, to my mind, to other people's minds, about the difference between Israel's response and Hamas's attack. But I want to say something very important about Pope Francis. For him, if you're looking to try to understand this better, it's about his empathy with those who are in pain, those who are suffering, and his role, as he saw it, as the shepherd of Catholicism and the shepherd of Christianity. And he had a relationship with a priest in Gaza, in the small Gaza Catholic community that felt under siege during this time. And he would speak to him quite regularly. Pope Francis would speak to this priest quite regularly. And it heavily influenced his statements about October 7th and its aftermath. I think what we don't know right now, although I will hunch a guess, is how the entire pontificate will be related to in the context of Catholic-Jewish relations. When there was so much positive, and yet at critical moments in the history of the Jewish people, there were things that Pope Francis said and did that came or landed in a negative way to many Jewish ears. If history is any barometer, it's the course of Catholic Jewish history that will ultimately matter, and its ability to sustain itself in the way that it has since 1965, moving forward into the future, where more and more Catholics are not from places where they can be in relationships with Jewish people. The Global South, Asia, Africa. Most popes have been from Europe. This pope was from the Global South, but he was from a vibrant Jewish community. It's likely that we're moving away from that model going into the future, and that worries all who are invested in Catholic-Jewish relations.
So now that we've unpacked the last 12 years of Pope Francis's papacy, what is his legacy with the Jewish people?
I think that it will be overwhelmingly positive with an asterisk. I think that time will be a healer. We cannot pretend that there weren't issues and challenges. But it is my hope and my belief that there is enough material and content there to put it into the wider positive arc of Catholic-Jewish relations, which is very strong, not least of which in the United States, where, for example, AJC and the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops just published the groundbreaking Translate Hate, the Catholic edition, in which the Catholic leadership in America partnered with AJC to put into a Jewish organizational publication, AJC's Translate Hate, Catholic commentary, as part of their commitment to combating anti-Semitism. How could we possibly not get our head around how historic that is, how transformative, how different that is than the history of Catholic-Jewish relations over 2 millennia? That is the greatest legacy of the Pope Francis era. And I think that's a positive way to put this moment when we are reflective about Pope Francis's legacy.
You mentioned that you have had audiences with the Pope. Is there one that was particularly memorable for you?
So there were big audiences, smaller audiences, and then very special moments. In the fall of 2021, when I was the then chair of IJCIC, the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations, and we had an assemblage of religious leaders from all over the world and all of religious expression. And I had the good fortune of representing the Jewish people. And then I was able to speak alongside Pope Francis and others on the question on one day on the environment and on the second day on education. On the second day, we were sitting around a beautiful boardroom-like table, the 15 representatives of the world's greatest faiths having a conversation. It is certainly for me one of the most, if not the most, cherished photographs of my professional career. It was like a working meeting. And in all of these cases, he was warm, intimate, outreached hand, a pastor. So that's the way I want to remember him on this day.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
My pleasure.
If you missed last week's episode, be sure to tune in for my conversation with AJC Chief Policy and Political Affairs Officer Jason Isaacson about the legacy of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, America's withdrawal from that deal in 2018, and Iran's dangerous stockpiling of uranium that's getting them closer to nuclear weapons capabilities. From April 27th through 29th, we will be at AJC Global Forum in New York City. Join American Jewish Committee and over 2,000 committed activists at the premier Global Jewish Advocacy Conference of the year. After the horrific attack on October 7th, 2023, and in this fraught moment for the global Jewish community, escalating threats worldwide underscore the importance of AJC's mission. All who care about the fate of the Jewish people, Israel, and the values of the civilized world must respond now with action, urgency, and resolve. If ever there was a time to stand up and be counted, that time is now. Your voice is needed now more than ever. If you won't be with us in person, you can tune into the webcast at ajc.org/globalforum2025. Thank you for listening. This episode is brought to you by AJC. Our producer is Atara Lakritz. Our sound engineer is TK Broderick. You can subscribe to People of the Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or learn more at ajc.org/peopleofthepod. The views and opinions of our guests don't necessarily reflect the positions of AJC. We'd love to hear your views and opinions or your questions. You can reach us at peopleofthepod@ajc.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to tell your friends, tag us on social media with #peopleofthepod, and hop on to Apple Podcasts to rate us and write a review to help more listeners find us. Tune in next week for another episode of People of the Pod.